school level to school level without any fear of what lies on the other side.
Imagine if our school gave us the extracurriculars necessary to give us to provide restore passion.
Imagine if what we learn in school is what we need for the workplace later on.
Imagine if conflict and disciplines were addressed in ways to help bring us back in rather than to further push us out.
Imagine if every school had at least one adult that a student could go to and trust with their challenges.
Imagine if all students could attend school without fearing for their physical safety.
Imagine if we are not merely passive receivers of school policies, but also actively involved in the decision-making process.
Imagine if all adults in schools and communities respect, celebrate, and empower each and every one of us in our developmental journey. Imagine
Our success in schools wasn't only defined by our grades, but also by our ability to think for ourselves, work together, and contribute to our communities.
All right. Imagine if we start this meeting with an extraordinarily inspiring and welcoming and wonderful set of insights from our young people. So let's have another round of applause for our young leaders. Good morning, everyone. Okay, this is school. Come on, remember. Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. All right, nice to have everyone here. My name is Tim Shriver. I am very, very proud to be one of the co-chairs of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. Together with Governor John Engler and Professor Linda Darling-Hammond, we work with an extraordinary team led by Jackie Jodel here at the Aspen Institute, and in fact led by many, many people in this room. In particular, three commissioners are here. I'll say a little bit more about Governor McAuliffe in a minute, but also Karen Pittman is here, who's on the commission. Chris Harried, who you just heard from. I don't know where Chris disappeared to. There he is. Also commissioners, and all of you who are panelists who have contributed and are contributing to what we think is an extraordinary moment in time. When this commission started, we didn't know we'd be here today in the midst of a national discussion that is extraordinarily rich with possibility. In the midst of a national discussion that is a bottom-up discussion, that is a youth-led discussion, where the voices of young people of all races and genders, of all political persuasions and backgrounds are rising up, as it were, almost from the earth to remind us of what's best about our country and to challenge us to fulfill the dreams that we have for our children. Imagine, as we just heard, if every child went to school feeling safe and valued, challenged and welcomed, on a path to becoming knowledgeable and responsible and caring. Imagine if this commission, if this community, if this room, in the ideal of Margaret Mead, the small group of dedicated people, imagine if we joined forces and created the kind of groundswell for change in our schools that our young people are demanding. Imagine if we did all that, and then imagine if we don't. I was talking to Scarlett Lewis, one of our panelists and commissioners, members of the Parent Council, and she and I shared a word that's hard to say, shame. How we feel, in some sense, ashamed of ourselves as adults, embarrassed, humiliated in some ways, for what we haven't done to make our country safe, to make our children safe. Shame is a hard word to say, it's a hard emotion to feel, but for many of us, it's the truth. Imagine if we are no longer ashamed of ourselves. The challenge is serious, it's immediate, it's big, it's urgent, and it's life and death. In my view, and it's not a point of view, it's real. It's a life and death challenge. Sometimes the life and death stakes are on the cover of newspapers and on the nightly news, but many times they're not. Many times, day after day, in our schools, in our cities, in our streets, in our towns, in our villages, the life and death stakes of depression and despair, of disillusionment and apathy, of cynicism and indifference are being lived out in our families around the country. If we don't make our schools safe, shame on us. And this is a room that understands that safety is about the absence of violence. Safety is also about the presence of belonging and trust. It is also about ensuring that each child knows that he or she has a purpose in the world, that they belong to a community that values their voice and their contribution, that they feel a sense of their own special desire and capacity to make a difference. All of those things are safety. Safety is trust in relationships so that when you need help, you seek it. When you seek it, you get it. When you get it, you get better. Yes, safety is the absence of violence, but it is so much more. I think we're in the midst of a moment where we are seeing a whole new version of an American patriot. A patriot is not just someone who fights an opponent somewhere else in the world, but someone who brings us together, who refreshes our spirit, who rebuilds our community from the bottom up. So our opponent, ladies and gentlemen, is negativity and cynicism and apathy and the sense that we can't do better. But we're here today to celebrate that not only scholars and not only scientists and not only professional educators and not only political leaders, but also average Americans can from the bottom up transform our schools and rebuild our country. And we're here to celebrate that young people are claiming their moment. Young people are claiming their moment, and wow, it's the most exciting moment in my experience. I'm 58 years old. It's the most exciting political moment in my life. Not because of what politicians are doing, but because what the country is seeing as its capacity to change from the bottom up. So my role today is not to go on and on as I just have done, but really just to share a little bit of the sequencing of our day and to let you have a sense of what's going to happen. You've got at your seats Imagine If cards. And if you're watching virtually, I hope you'll take the chance. We'll say a little bit more about this towards the end of the program. But take a chance to fill yours out. Not right this minute, but before you leave today. We're going to start a process that will invite all of us, many, many people, we hope thousands of people, to join us in this Imagine If adventure and to marshal the energy necessary to fulfill the dreams that we each have. So take a look at those. I also want to call your attention to the presence of our tremendous visual artist, Greg Gersh, who's here. Give Greg a wave. Greg, wave, yeah. Greg will be capturing for us visually the course of our conversation, and hopefully for those of us who love to learn visually, help us to imagine by seeing, not just by writing and thinking. So we thank you, Greg, for being here and for helping us to capture this extraordinary moment. My next role is to introduce to you the former governor of the great state of Virginia, a man who actually really needs no introduction in this town or almost in any room in the country, a person who single-handedly has helped build a political process and a political ideal for his party and for the country that has brought to office some of the most historic and path-breaking leaders in our history. Terry McAuliffe is here in this room, though, because he's also a commissioner. And he's also the governor whose work resulted in the largest single increase in education spending in the history of his state and a commitment to lower tuition or to stabilize tuition in his state for higher education and for access. So if we want to look for a political leader who's paid his dues to try to bring candidates to the fore who can make this country safe, or a political leader who understands the relationship between that vision and education, we couldn't ask for a better one than Governor Terry McAuliffe. Governor.
Thank you, Tim. Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, come on, you do better than that. Good morning. It's exciting. Thank you. You're only about a mile from Virginia, so if you're here visiting, go across the Potomac River, spend a little money. I want to thank Tim for his great leadership. Give Tim another great round of applause. And Tim and I have worked on a lot of causes together, and there literally is no one who is more passionate. When he gets his teeth into something, he goes at it. And I want to thank you for what you've done for children, what you have done with the Special Olympics. You and your family have done so much for our great country, and thank you. And to all the folks who are here with us today, this is a great conversation we're going to have. Could not be, as Tim mentioned, a better time for us to have this conversation on education and how we bring folks together. I just finished up as the 72nd governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's a very unique seat. Our first governor, of course, Patrick Henry, who started the American Revolution, give me liberty, give me death. Our second governor, of course, Thomas Jefferson, and now Terry McAuliffe. I mean, is this not a great country we live in? And I was born in New York, who knew? But you know, my whole emphasis when I was governor was about building the new economy. I ended up creating 200,000 new jobs, 20 billion of new economic activity, billions more than any governor. But for me, all of that came down to education because, you know, I'm great at sales and I was the most traveled governor in America, 35 trade missions to 5 continents. If you don't have a great education system, none of it matters. Businesses aren't going to come to your state. So it starts early. And that's why, as Tim mentioned, I put $1 billion to redesign our K-12 in Virginia, redesigned all of our higher ed. We're the first state in America now to offer cybersecurity in kindergarten. Why? I have 40,000 cyber jobs open in Virginia today. Starting pay is $88,000. You don't need a 4-year degree, 2-year, most community colleges. So for me, the whole emphasis and why today's discussion is so important, we got to retool our education system. We got to make it more adaptable to what the jobs that exist out there. Too many people go to school and don't get skills to match all the open jobs that we have. So many, and I have 5 children, to be honest with you. And I did have one philosophy major, to be honest with you. God bless her. She went over to Africa for 5 years, saved elephants. She's now back doing private equity in New York. Had a son who's a Marine, just got back from Iraq last week. It was a Naval Academy, a lieutenant now in the Marine Corps. I've had all my kids have done very different things, but it all literally goes back to what I think is education. And that's why our discussion is so important. How do we better interrelate what we're doing in the world out there today to what happens in the classroom starting early? As Tim mentioned, safety issues, obviously, and I want to commend all those Parkland students. That march, I was at the march last week in Washington. I mean, it was truly extraordinary. That and the Women's March we had 2 years ago. I've been marching for a long time. 2 of the greatest marches I've ever seen, but what was impressive was this was done by Parkland students who got all these folks all over the country. And I think it has ignited young people all over the country to get themselves active politically. You know, historically, young people turning out to vote was a very low percentage in our country. I think what happened in Parkland has really ignited something across the country, and I think it's going to go on for a long time. We talk about responsibility and dealing with one another. You know, my best day as governor was probably when I restored the rights of 175,000 felons, more than any governor in U.S. history. My worst day was Charlottesville, Virginia, when thousands of people came in, alt-right, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, spewing the worst things. I could not even mention that in this crowd. I was there on the sidelines watching the hate-filled speech that they screamed at African Americans, they screamed at members of the Jewish faith. And I thought to myself that day, how did we get to a place in America where people feel comfortable walking down a beautiful city street of Charlottesville, Virginia? How do we feel comfortable that we can say these types of things? You know, people used to wear hoods. They don't wear hoods anymore. They'll go ahead and say what they want to say. So my point, I literally the next day, I called all of my superintendents in school and said, we got to start teaching earlier in school, understanding, relationships, tolerance, which we don't do enough of that out there. So it's important today. I have a very diverse state, Virginia. I have Used to be coal, textile, furniture, tobacco. I have the largest naval base in the world, the most military installations, Northern Virginia. All of that is unique. And that's why every local community is a little bit different on their education system. But we need to do a better job of listening to parents, listening to students, and bringing that all together. And that's why we're here today. So I thank you for being here for this great discussion we're having. Let me bring up our panelists that we have here today. We have Grace Dolan Sandrino. Come on up. Grace, who is a high school senior at the Duke Ellington School of Arts, and she's actually taking theater arts. And
I was a theater student for 3 years, and now I study writing. So.
Now you do what?
Writing.
Well, good for you. We need more writers. Next, we have up Eric Gersey. Come on up, Eric. Eric is a freshman at Princeton University. He is at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Diplomacy and International Affairs. And Eric, let me ask you this. Where was Woodrow Wilson born?
Virginia.
Right, very good answer. Which state has the most presidents?
Virginia.
Virginia. You know how many? Anybody? 8. 8 from Virginia. Very exciting. Number 2, Ohio, 7. New York, 5. Massachusetts, 4. So we're coming up there, Massachusetts. Next, we have Diana Pritchard. Come on up, Diana, up again. She is from Fowler, Michigan. 2 adolescent daughters.
Yes.
And she is a freelance journalist, an author, a photographer. But most importantly, she is a hog farmer. She is a first-generation female farmer at a hog farm she has. So even give us some tips later on that, Diana. And Diana Lamanji, come on up. From Queens, New York.
That's right.
2 young children, a blogger, co-founder of DLG Media, which elevates the voices of multicultural America. So we thank you for that. So let's have a good discussion of what we need to do. We talk all the time about what happens in school, building relationships. Why is it, let's start with the 2 students, Eric and Grace, why is it that having these relationships is so important to the development of what you need?
Yeah, I think that a lot of this work comes down to the idea of the 21st century. I think we talk a lot about the 21st century. Politicians from the right, politicians from the left love to sort of slap the 21st century on sort of any bill and think that that brings legitimacy to it. But the reality is that the 21st century is here. Folks sort of need to wake up if they're pushing back against that idea. The jobs of the future are the jobs of today. And I think that these are sort of the skills that we need to cultivate. These are the skills that we need to learn in order to be successful in our future. So 21st century is here, and today's kindergartners, and you talked about this, Governor, the work that you did in Virginia, today's kindergartners are going to graduate in 2030. So this is right where we are, smack in the middle of the 21st century, and we need to be prepared for what's in front of us. There's a lot of trends out there. Some of them are scary. AI's on the forefront. There's technology that's developing, but having a sense of empathy, having a sense of grit, no machine's going to learn that. We're going to learn that, and that's what we need to do in our classrooms.
And did you feel through K through 12 that you actually had a relationship with a peer there who helped you prepare for the future or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's helped me a lot in college, and I hope that I'm going to be able to take that with me as I graduate and go into the real world.
Yeah, good.
I think that it's really important that students have strong relationships with administrators and teachers, but also their peers in the classroom. Because if we don't feel safe and we don't feel supported and we don't feel like we belong in the classroom, then we are going to, recede. We're going to sit back. We're not going to participate. And as a result of that, our grades are going to plummet. And right now, a lot of schools are only looking at students and their SAT scores and their grades, and there's not a holistic review process. So our students, if they're not met with the supports that they need when they come into their school buildings, they're not going to feel safe. They're not going to feel ready to take risks and participate in class, and that's only going to hurt us. So it's really important that we see these strong relationships with our teachers where they can understand what's going on with us at home, and we feel like we can go and talk to them about anything. Because we spend a lot of time with our teachers and we spend a lot of time in our school buildings, and it's really important that we feel safe there and that we're ready to do the work.
I mentioned Charlottesville was probably my worst day as governor. And these people somehow believe it's okay to go out and scream and say horrible things about people. When you were in school, did you feel that there was adequate discussion of interpersonal relationships and how you treat people with dignity and respect?
I think that I can confidently say that in middle school that was not the case. I transitioned in middle school. I transitioned in the middle of my 8th grade year. And it was a really rough time. You know, I was 13 going through something that was at the time there was not a lot of information accessible about, trans students in schools. There were no policies, and it was not a conversation that my school was having. There was not a place for me to develop strong relationships with my teachers because my teachers didn't know how to teach me in the classroom. So I think that this is something that's really important, not only for trans students, but for all students, that we are going through things at home all the time, and conversations aren't always being held, but they need to be held, and we do need to be teaching tolerance, but going a step above tolerance and acceptance and embracing our fellow students. And creating a strong community where everyone feels supported. I can turn to any student and say, hey, I need help either on this assignment or I need help with something that's going on in the hallway. So I don't think that conversations were happening for me in middle school, but when I went to high school, which was a school that is implementing social and emotional learning in the classroom, I definitely saw a difference.
And I think it's too late when you get to high school. I mean, you've got to start early. Even, really K through 5 is when you really need to begin to develop it. Dana, what are your thoughts on relationships and how parents should interact with the school and how you help build those?
I think in our community, one thing I've seen a lot of is our school leaders, there's not a lot of ego there. And I think that's really important on both sides, from parents as well as school administrators. It's important that we view things as a partnership. And I'm in our school, I really see leaders seeing themselves as being in service to students and in service to families. And I see families at the same time seeing themselves as being a scaffolding of support for the school. And I think so building those relationships as partnerships rather than trying to have some sort of hierarchy where the family thinks, they know best and the school thinks they know best, can really help us move forward and design programs that work for every community.
And as you know, students spend more time at school than they do at home when you think about it. So
they do. That's true.
Absolutely. Anna?
Yeah, it's a partnership. What happens in school, our kids bring back home. What happens at home, our kids bring into school. Like you said, kids are in school. My son, he's here. He's in school from 8 a.m. to about 5:30 with extracurriculars. He's really only at home, we have 2.5, 3 hours at home. So it can be also, even that schedule can be really challenging, I think, for a child. It's go, go, go. We're going to be late. There's not enough time. Move it. So I think all of that also puts stress on a child. And I think that it's important for schools and school administrators to know their families and know what's happening at home, because their education is being affected by that. So it's really about educating the whole child, because those worlds don't live in silos, right? Everything is connected.
Yeah. Let's talk about, Eric, we'll start with you on the issue in education and how we prepare you for the future. We got a lot of issues. I'm very concerned. We have so many millions of jobs open in America today. We don't have enough people to fill those jobs to match the skills that actually exist. In Virginia, as I mentioned, I have 40,000 cyber jobs open. I have so many welding jobs open because of the shipyard. Starting pay in the welding, about $72,000 in Virginia. Many of these jobs, traditionally people thought, well, I don't want to do that. It's a trade job. That doesn't work. But how do we do a better job of building an education system where it actually understands what the jobs are you're going to face when you get out of school in a couple years, and really start earlier? And that's why in Virginia we're doing cybersecurity in kindergarten. Understanding the concepts you need to know. And then second question is what I call street smarts. To make sure when you get out that students actually, it's not just your grade point average. I always make the point, I've owned 30 companies. I owned one, I built 6,000 homes. I never cared what someone who worked for me got on their GPA. I really didn't, or their SAT. If that happened, I'd be in real trouble. When I had a problem, I wanted someone to be able to just figure it out. It really didn't matter what you got in your GPA, but it's just that street smarts that we've got to do a better job in our education system. And I think the parents would agree with this as well. So,
definitely, and I think that those two questions have a lot of interaction, a lot of overlap. I think that a lot of the conversations we've had on the Youth Commission so far have started with redefining what success looks like in school. And we talk a lot about college and career, and those are both so important, but it's college, career, and life, and those all have interactions, and none of those live in silos. So when we leave high school, we should be prepared for whatever that next step is, and we should not have a stigma attached around going into the trades, going into jobs that have real benefit for students immediately upon graduating high school, but those jobs we need to be prepared for those. It can't be a society where you're either going to college or you're going to minimum wage work. That is an unsustainable future for our country. So I think that it starts with planning early in school. It starts with really having relationships with adults who can listen to us, hear what we're passionate about, and then connect us with those opportunities, and have school really start reflecting what the real world looks like early in middle school and in high school, exposing us to job opportunities, apprenticeships, other internship opportunities, and also cultivating the sort of social emotional skills that we've talked about, because those are really the foundation of what we're going to see in the work world. And then on top of that, we need to be able to learn, we need to be able to read, we need to be able to write, we need to be able to sort of critically think and grapple with material in front of us, but we also need to be able to work with our fellow workers, our coworkers. We need to have a sense of empathy for the world around us and sort of bring all those pieces together in order to think about what that next step is, whatever that might be for us.
yeah. One thing we instituted in Virginia, we now, beginning of school year, we have economic counselors, we call them, that come in early on and they tell you what jobs are open today, how much those jobs pay. And I tell you, for someone in 4th or 5th grade, their eyes, they get huge. But this job today, we have X number of jobs open and they pay this amount of money. To really get people earlier thinking, holy cow, this is something I ought to do.
Yeah, I think we've talked about the idea of a 4-year plan for a while. It needs to be sort of a 6-year plan, a 7-year plan, and just really thinking about careers and colleges and options really early on, and then planning from there.
Because a lot of the root of the problem we have, and we'll do this next, talk about the opiate crisis we have and the drug problems that we have in the workforce today. But a lot of that goes back to people who are in poverty situations or don't have jobs or don't have hope. A lot of them, unfortunately, then end up in a place that as a state, we've got to provide for them, we've got to do the treatments and so forth. I mean, in the Chamber of Commerce down in Danville, I went and spoke recently, and they told me that 80% of their job applicants, 80% fail the drug test. 80. They can't fill the jobs they got. So it's really going back early on and making sure people have hope. Grace?
Yeah, I think that Eric brought up a really good point of redefining what success means and redefining how we measure success and how we measure merit.
And what does that mean to you? What is success? Is that making money?
Well, to me, success is one, like having a good level of internal happiness and being able to, take care of yourself, but also being able to retain information that you're taught in classrooms, but also the skills that you're taught. And if I have a 4.5 GPA, but I'm not very good at collaborating or articulating my thoughts, I might run into some problems when I enter college or when I enter a job. And when we have such a strong focus on academic grit and not developing students' skills that they need to have a good life, we're not going to be seeing a lot of people who are successful in their jobs. They may be making money, they may not, but I think that it goes beyond money when I talk about success. And it's like, are you feeling good at work? Are you effectively communicating? Can you work with a team? Can you speak in front of an audience? But also, I think that goes back to what kind of assignments we're getting in class. Are we getting presentations? Are we doing peer evaluations? Are we learning how to give and receive criticism? So I think that all of the issues that we run into are definitely based in how we're taught, but also transforming the idea of what success is, and then implementing new practices in education.
How about from the parents' perspective? Obviously, nothing more important. And when your children graduate, they have an opportunity to go into a nice paying job.
Yeah, I think that is very important. But as much as SEL gives back to individual children, I think it's also really valuable because, as you're saying, there are so many trade jobs, there are so many employment opportunities that we can't fill because of multiple issues, whether it's drug issues or, in many cases, social and emotional incompetencies where people can't hold the job once they get them. So I think for me, I want this for my children so that they can achieve success and happiness, as Grace said, but also so that they can give back to their community. Many rural communities are dying off, and part of that is because people don't have the skills, and they don't have the background leading up to adulthood so that they can be successful and they can go back to contribute to their small towns.
Yeah, it's really important for schools and community organizations to work together because, you know, it's not, the kids are not going to always live in school, right? They're going to need to go out into their community. And it's about giving back. It's about learning how to work collaboratively. You know, it's about teaching kids to respect their elders, which is something that I think we don't often talk to our children about. You know, my son's school, they do something really great, which is classes go to sing to elder centers, which I think is fabulous. There's another great example about schools going into the community. In Harlem, in New York City, there's an organization called Harlem Grown. They take plots of land, the children go out, they learn about healthy eating, they learn about you know, sustainability, growing food. That food gets given back to the community. So all of these partnerships are really, really important. And you know, as you're going out into the community, you're learning how to work in teams, how to speak to people that are not like you, speak to people that are different ages, you know, manage problems, problem solve, you know, manage your own internal, you know, not aggression, but your emotions, right? Like if I'm working on a project in the community, I need to learn how to regulate myself. So that's not, it can be taught in the classroom, but really working with outside the classroom is really important.
So that brings up another interesting topic, which is the whole issue of community service. You've all sort of touched on it a little bit. I happen to be an advocate of compulsory national service. I've said it. My wife serves on the national board. We were the first state in America to be designated as a employer of national service. I just think it's important that we give back. You go to look at some of the countries around the globe that, you know, like Israel, doesn't have to be the military. I'm not saying it has to be the military. Only 0.5% of our children today serve in the United States military, but it ought to be, it could be doing anything, working in schools. We have a shortage of teachers today all across the country, a dire need. And let us also commend those great teachers, especially those in West Virginia, those in Oklahoma the other day who got a $6,100 raise and they said, no dice. You got to put money into the school, just don't give it to us. I mean, I want to commend all the teachers that have really done great work out there. Really great stuff. And, you know, I did 3 pay raises in 4 years as governor. They hadn't had one in 8 years, but I'm still $7,200 under the national average. So, you know, the pay is a big importance. But what do you think, obviously, about doing some type of compulsory? We in America, you have to give back. I think it will integrate folks so much more. Rich and poor work together, people from different races. You come together and work on a project together. It would make, I think, America much stronger. And I just happen to think people ought to give back. But
well, I agree with you, Governor, but I think that also needs to start in school.
Yep.
Diversifying our schools. We see increased school segregation in our country.
So explain to me what you mean by that.
So I think that we've seen data that's shown that our schools are as segregated now as they've ever been, and to think that after the history of our country that we're back in that same position, I think is scary, and it's harmful for students. So I think that being able to look at our peers in our classrooms as being able to work together, both inside and outside the classrooms, connecting our classrooms with the community, that's really where it starts. And then from there, I think thinking about service after school is critically important.
So if I'm governor, what's your recommendation to me that I could do?
Well, I think that we should start in middle school and in high school, and we have communities.
But doing what?
So we have community service hours, which are excellent, but I think that we need to be a little bit more strategic about how we use them, because a lot of students, I think, can sort of get their way to community service hours without really engaging with the community, without really being out there, without really hearing from other folks and stepping foot into neighborhoods that they might be unfamiliar with and really connecting with nonprofits that are doing work on the ground. So I think that rethinking the way that community service hours look currently, whether you increase the hours or you redefine what it means to get a community service hour is really critical. And then from there, I think that we can think about mandatory service or some sort of encouraged service with incentives for young people to go out there, learn about their communities, give back in some way, hear about the problems, but also do that collaboratively and learn from the people with whom they're working on those projects.
So Eric raised a good point, and I happen to agree 100%. I think we're as divided in our country as we've ever been, at least in our recent history. I won't make today political. I have my theories on several of the reasons, but I won't get into that today. But how do we deal with this in community service, and how do we do a better job in schools? Because it's really the crux of what we need to do. In addition to skills, it's these interpersonal relationships and treating people, everybody with dignity.
Yeah, and I believe that comes from actually the implementation of teaching these skills, and that with teaching respect and teaching collaboration, whether that's like explicit or integrated, that then these become from young ages, that these become the morals and the values of these students, and that community service becomes something that is innate. And not something that, oh, you have 150 hours to fill. How are you going to do that? You have to do it by graduation. But something where I'm going out every other weekend or for a few hours throughout the week, and I'm going to this to do this project because it's something that I was brought upon and taught in school to do. And then that becomes that also influences the way that people move when they leave school, whether that's in school or in a job. But I think that it all does begin with like the cultivation of these skills, and that then it becomes just second nature. But I mean, that's what I have about that one.
As a parent, obviously, most important things we can teach our children. Treating everybody dignity, respect, tolerance, and so forth. How can we do a better job and interrelate that with the schools?
Yeah, I think you've made a great point that community service is an important part of developing empathy. And it is a little bit political. I mean, we've included policymakers in our call to action for a reason, because they hold a tremendous amount of power in our communities, in our state, and then, of course, at the national level as well. I don't know if compulsory service is necessarily the way to go. I think one of the important things that we're trying to get at with social and emotional development in schools is that we're really bringing up adults. And so we need our adults to also have social and emotional competence. And part of that is understanding, I think, how our actions affect other people and how they're likely to respond to those. And one thing that I think we see a lot is when we start forcing things on people, they start really pushing back and they have a problem with that. And then that's how we become more and more polarized. So I don't know if I would make it mandatory, but I think definitely if I were speaking to my governor, I would be asking them to start a campaign to convince schools that it's important to have community service in their community, to convince just citizens and voters themselves that their children should be doing community service.
I think I would even start these opportunities earlier, like kindergarten. Why are we not starting kindergarten? Kids can go to the local park and, help clean up. They can make signs. My son and I sometimes at our local park, we volunteer to man the compost station. And these are things that really impact, our children. So I think that it's important to start early, and it's also important to include it as part of the curriculum. Right? So we know that in kindergarten, kids are going to do, 2 service projects, and it's going to it can be incorporated into science and math and all these other, academic skills, but as part of the curriculum.
Yeah. Let's touch on the safety issue. We've all mentioned a little bit, obviously, what happened in Parkland, keeping our schools safe, most important. Obviously, any parent drops their child off at school, you're going to assume and hope that child is going to be as safe as possible. Obviously, there's going to be flaws in the system, incidents that happen. The gentleman at Parkland never should have had a gun. The gun debate's a different thing. It's not what we're here today. But the whole issue of keeping our communities safe, and I also want to touch on the issue of the drug problem that exists in this country today. The single biggest issue I had as governor was the opiate crisis. And all 50 governors would tell you the exact same thing. It is a crisis of such staggering proportion. I lose more than automobile deaths in Virginia. Thousands of people died last year due to the opiate crisis. And, you know, this is friends, neighbors. I mean, the class of people who are caught up in this opiate addiction, it's everybody. And this fentanyl, which comes from China, it is so cheap, it is so deadly, it is so addicting that you get somebody on fentanyl and, you know, the issues that come after that are so devastating. So how do we deal with these issues in school?
Yeah, before we address that question, I just want to touch a little bit on what Diana just said, which was a really good point about these things really need to be intentional. All these discussions that we're having and all these skills that we want to integrate can't sort of be by accident. We need them to be intentional. We need our adults in our building to be enforcing these and implementing these every single day. With regard to safety, I think it's important to note that there are a number of different levels of safety. There's physical safety, there's emotional safety, and both of those things create a sense of belonging in the school, a sense that you are safe, but they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. They sort of create the conditions under which we want to learn as students, the conditions that we deserve and that we need in order to effectively do the work that's in front of us in the classroom each and every day. But again, we can have the safest school in America, but there can be no learning that's going on inside. We need safe schools, but we also need social emotional learning. We need math and literacy, grit and empathy. All these things need to happen inside the schools, none of which can happen without safety, but none of which safety causes.
Mm-hmm. Were you ever instructed in school about the dangers of opiates?
Yeah, so especially recently, we've had an increase in the education regarding opioids, drugs, but I think that some curriculum is rolled out in such a way that you have an isolated health curriculum that occurs once during your career, and that's it. It's sort of a one and done, but we see different trends that are emerging in this country. We see different drugs that are emerging, and we need sort of a constant education. I think that something else with regard to your question about opioids and other drugs is that we've sort of moved away in this country generally from a model of rehabilitation and a model of bringing people back in to a model of forcing people back out and a retributive approach to criminal justice or justice in general. I mean, one statistic that I've recently come across is that if you're an African-American male and you don't graduate from high school, chances are you're going to end up in prison at some point in your life. I mean, we just can't go on as a society like that. And I think that all these things need to speak to bringing people back in instead of pushing people out in our classrooms and in our schools.
Eric, if I could just really quickly follow up on that. There's definitely right now a culture of expulsion, suspension, and then continuing to build the school to prison pipeline, and that's also an issue of safety within our schools, of not feeling not knowing what's going to happen to us when there is a mistake made or when there's an altercation or incident in our schools, and that it should really, that our school policies, disciplinary policies should really be focused on that rehabilitation and keeping students inside of school, because we can't learn if we're outside of school. And you know, this also has to do with community service, is having restorative practices going on inside our school. There should be restorative justice circles inside of our schools. We should be making sure that students are coming together and student-led conflict resolution. So then we're building a community, we're building empathy, we're building the skills that students need, students with students, and keeping students inside of our schools. So I think that that's another really important thing when we talk about safety in our schools, is what it looks like for students when they are faced with like disciplinary actions. And it shouldn't be punitive, it should be very restorative, and that this is an example of community service, getting involved with your school community and helping other students.
And you felt comfortable that you could always, if you wanted to be student-led, that the school would support you in doing these types of things?
Well, I'm very lucky that my school does support our restorative justice circle, but there are so many students across the country that if they wanted to, if they tried to start a restorative justice circle or even suggest something of restorative practice, that they would be shot down, and that is where we need the culture of student voice being at the center to really to really be uplifted, and that everything that students need to feel like they have a seat at the table, and that we can talk to our administrators and make recommendations without being turned away.
So can I just add, I think that there are two things. One thing that I don't think I see in schools right now, and I don't know, my son's only in first grade, but I remember when I was little, and I won't say how old I am, but when I was little, I remember campaigns about drugs are, say no to drugs, right? And I don't think I see that now. I think what I see now, at least in the media, is there's a crisis, what do we do? So it's not preventing. It's not how do we prevent this from happening, it's how do we solve this issue, this crisis that is already here. So I think that we really need to start kind of talking to our children about what happens when you do drugs, but also I think that once we work on our social and emotional learning for our children, they're gonna have skills to be able to deal with issues, because a lot of young people, they turn to drugs because they don't know how to deal with the problems that they're having. So they use drugs as an escape, right? As a way to deal with whatever it may be, bullying, they can't find a job, they feel like they don't belong anywhere. So I think that if starting very young in kindergarten, first grade, they're taught that they belong, that they're taught how to deal with their problems, how to speak. Maybe they're afraid to speak to their family members. All these things, if you're learning that from a very young age, that really does get ingrained. It's amazing the things that they pick up and they continue, right? Kind of developing. And I think that that's why the social and emotional part is so important, starting at a young age, because that does help along the older they get.
I think that's such an important point, that SEL can be preventative. And I have been watching our visual artist over here, and I see there's a risk versus reward graph as part of the visual art that he's creating for us today. And I thought that was really appropriate, because as parents, we often talked about, when we were talking about safety, how academic growth is really a risky business. It requires you to take risk, because ultimately you have to have a free exchange of ideas, opinions. You have to be able to discuss things and feel safe discussing things with the students and with the leaders in your school, so that the adults can kind of guide the discussions. And without safety, physical safety, social safety, and emotional safety, that exchange of ideas can't happen. And I think it kind of goes back to the last thing we discussed, where we're seeing that even playing out with adults today, where we don't really have a free exchange of ideas. What we have is a couple of ideas, and adults trying to force their ideas on others, rather than trying to come together, discuss the ideas, and pick out the best ones. So that's really where I think social and emotional learning in schools can help children become better adults for the future, is teaching them how to do that, how to get together and discuss things and really grow intellectually.
Great. Before I run out of time, so we got two more questions, but one thing I think we should address is the whole issue of nutrition, because there is nothing more fundamental to schools than a child. Our children are hungry to learn, but you cannot learn if you're just plain hungry. We were in a horrible situation when I got elected as governor of Virginia, and my wife, Dorothy, took on this leadership role. And through her efforts, last year, 10 million more breakfasts were served to needy children in Virginia. You have no idea. We can talk about all these other issues, but if a child comes to school hungry, I don't think you truly appreciate how many children may not have had a dinner the night before, and they clearly had no breakfast. So as much as this child wants to learn, unless we can provide, and the federal government has a program, believe it or not, it's 100% reimbursed. And unfortunately, the former governor of Virginia didn't believe in it, didn't believe in bringing down federal money. I'll be very honest with you, I am not a Tea Party governor. If they have federal money in Washington, I want every penny in Virginia. I don't care about the other 49 states. But the idea that you would leave money on the table for hungry children. And so, it takes a little bit of work, and you've got to change how you do it as well, because you can't just, the people who were needy and poverty, they would go into the classroom, into the cafeteria early in the morning. So when everybody else came and said, oh, there's all the poor kids. There's all the poor kids having breakfast. So we've changed that whole model in Virginia. Now we don't have that anymore. Every child now in Virginia gets a breakfast. It's called grab and go. You come in and there's a little, it's a sausage biscuit, maybe an apple and an orange juice, and you go in your homeroom. And you sit with the other kids, everybody gets it. And I'm telling you, our scores have gone up dramatically in Virginia. Absenteeism has dropped. Discipline has dropped dramatically since we have been able to do it. So I think we ought to touch a little bit, because to me, the nourishment of the body helps get nourishment of the mind.
If I could, I think that yes, every student having, being well nourished is something that's important. But I think that it even goes beyond just being nourished by breakfast or lunch, but making sure that we are supporting students in everything that they might not be getting at home, whether that is a dinner or breakfast that morning, but also making sure that students have adequate support systems in school with support staff, with psychologists and social workers that they can speak to, just regular support staff, and that every student has an advisor that they can go to, who they can talk to about the issues that they're having at home, but also the issues that they're facing at school. So I think making sure that students are being met with every need, whether it's breakfast or a support staff worker.
Yeah, and just to add on to Grace's point, this, I think, speaks to the larger fact that learning doesn't happen in isolation. We need to be ready to walk into our classrooms, but readiness, we're not always ready. It's not just an on-off switch. There's a lot of conditions that affect whether students are ready to learn. There's a lot of conditions that are happening outside the classroom, and students want to learn, as you said, Governor. We just need the right conditions to do so.
I do think everybody wants to learn. They really do.
Well, in New York, I can't complain. New York City has free breakfast for all. We have free lunch for all, and we even have summer.
Summer,
Yep. So we're doing a good job there.
In fact, my wife was telling me the other day, we had a snowstorm in Virginia, and she was talking to one of the principals. The principal at school was closed due to snow, and it was out in Southwest Virginia. And kids call up his school closed, say, there was nothing more exciting than to find out you didn't have school. And the principal picked up the phone as a young kid and said, "Are we school today?" And she said, "No." And the kids started to cry. And he said, "I'm not going to have any food today then." You don't realize how tough it is.
That in New York City, that is part of the reason why sometimes when schools, when there's snowstorms, schools stay open and parents get really upset. Why is school open? It's a blizzard. And the chancellor had said because of that, because if we don't keep the school open, kids are going to go hungry. So it's a big concern.
The National School Lunch Program, I don't know, you probably already know this, started out as a community program. It was very small, and then continued to grow until the national government finally picked it up. And so it really does tie in very closely here. Of course, we want students to be able to learn, and you can't learn if you're hungry, you can't learn if you're cold, you can't learn if you're worried about if you're going to have a roof over your head at night. All of those things are very important. But it does tie in so neatly with this because it is about building strong communities, and feeding our children should be community-based. It's fine for the national government to be involved, of course, because they are, and we have a very strong and robust program for that. But things like the National Farm to Cafeteria program are very important in bringing in local economic support, bringing in local foods, bringing in healthy foods, and really making it, once again, I think we got away from viewing it as enriching our own communities. We really got away from that, and so bringing it back around to that now, I think will also just gain more support.
Yeah, the free breakfast program for schools, actually, I don't know if you know, it started in World War II because the generals were complaining that our children were too malnutritious to serve in the military. So that's actually how it actually got going. So you've got a couple documents. This is your time. What is the one takeaway you would want everybody here at this Aspen conference to take away from the documents that you have, if you could pick one thing?
I think one really important takeaway is that relationships matter in school. Relationships matter, period, but relationships especially matter in school given the amount of time that we spend there and given what our schools look like. And relations can't be formed by accident. Every student needs to have an adult in the building whom he or she trusts, can go to. And that, again, can't happen by accident. We need adults in the building, school leaders, to make sure that that happens, and then from there train all of our adults in the building to recognize signs of things like mental illness in students, conditions they might be facing around school or outside of school, to really create a scaffolded network of supports to support students throughout the day.
Relationships and having an adult person in that school you can deal with.
Definitely.
Great.
I think that, you know, I would argue social emotional learning is something that you need to have because it's even more important than academics in a way. You know, I can tell you that I don't know when it was the last time that I used trigonometry, what I learned in chemistry, but I can tell you that every day I need to know how to manage my emotions at work, how to work well with others, how to respond to the world around me, how to handle conflict. So all those things we need to teach our kids starting at a very early age.
Yeah, I think the one takeaway that for me is that we're not asking necessarily for more, for the schools to do more, because we realize that educators are operating with limited resources. We're really just asking for things to be better. And, you know, we talked about the opioid crisis. We talked about school lunches. This is all, social and emotional learning is a foundation. And so it's not about doing more, it's about doing better. It's about looking at programs maybe that aren't working as well, or that could simply just work better by replacing it with a social and emotional program.
I just hope that everybody can take away the importance of the student voice, and that in our youth call to action, we wrote this, and we are high school and college students, but we have something to say, and that a lot of the issues that we are facing in our school districts and our communities, students have views on, but we also have solutions. So we are ready to step up, but we want you to let us step up, and we are also ready to change our schools and really, really work hard on implementing social emotional learning in all of our schools. So.
We got a couple minutes. Anybody in the audience like to ask a question? I always like to open it up in these forums. If anybody would like to ask one of our panelists a question, this is your time. Don't want you just sitting there like potted plants. I'd love to have you as part of the conversation. Yes.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the refreshing panel. I work with young people daily too, so it was great to see you guys represented up there. One of my questions is, yes, I love SEL and I really respect the work as a psychologist and as a public health practitioner as well, but how do we work with teachers SEL? Because a lot of times, as Mr. Shriver, I think you were talking about Tim. Sir Tim was talking about the ground up approach, the bottom up approach, which I totally respect and agree with. And getting teachers to buy into that and understand that youth advocates can teach them something and coach them along in the needs to properly serve young people. So what are some of the pointers you would give in coaching your teachers in their own navigation of their social and emotional learning?
I think I can take this one. In the family call to action, we specifically included that we would like schools to be supporting teachers' social and emotional competencies themselves, because it is so important. And first of all, because adults have to model social and emotional competencies or children can't learn them. And I think some of the things that we hit on, if I can remember correctly, in the call to action was really that we want the schools, first of all, to be supporting teachers and all staff members, not just teachers, but cafeteria workers, bus drivers, hall monitors, office workers, their mental health at the school. So what we're really asking is that the school adopt a culture of social and emotional competency so that teachers are supported every day. And then, of course, also making social and emotional competence part of the professional development on an ongoing basis would be really important as well.
I think that's also something that is really important to address, because there's no way that teachers can model SEL if they don't have that training. And you know, we all miss those days of school for like for professional development. So making sure that there's funding there for specialists to come in and train our teachers, because our teachers want to do this. I have never heard of a teacher that really does, oh, I don't want to support you. I don't want to make sure that you succeed. So I think it's really important that we also recognize that our teachers want this to happen, and that we change that narrative that teachers don't want to, or that schools don't want to. But there are also schools that need assistance, that need help with these resources. So it's really about finding them, but then also training our teachers so that our teachers can help us.
Good morning. Hi, Erin.
Nice to see you coming from Montgomery County. My question is around cultural competence. Grace, you had mentioned getting support for yourself during middle school, I think you said, as well as the issues around discipline and African American students in the school to prison pipeline. What role do you see cultural competence playing in our schools, particularly when you look at the makeup of teachers, which is over 70% white women, versus what our student body is, which is much more diverse than that? And where does cultural competence come in to address these issues around supporting children who need it for all kinds of different diversity reasons, as well as our curriculum and addressing some of these issues around social emotional learning and discipline?
I can take that one. So in New York City, at my school in particular, we focus a lot on linguistic and cultural competency. We offer, programs so that parents who don't speak the language necessarily can come and feel that they can communicate with teachers and school staff. It's really important to also value that richness that the different cultures bring and language bring. So in New York City, I know we're doing a lot of work around cultural competency.
I mean, it's a huge problem in the country. So last year we took action in Virginia. If you looked at statistics, 4 times more African American students, suspension or expulsion. Also disabled children, proportionately dramatically high, as well as Hispanic children. And it was so disparate across our state, 9 million people, that we actually had every school district and every school, we made them sign a contract that they could only suspend, bless you, they could only suspend, they could only expel, very strict guidelines to bring some uniformity. And it's dropped dramatically because they finally figured the state is actually paying attention to this. The damage it does to a child, clearly if you expel the child, but just to send them home for 3 days, a week, or 2 weeks, you're already putting that child in real jeopardy when other things you can do. It's too easy to say, call the police and take them, I just want them out. It's too easy to do that. So we're trying to fix that. So if we could give Eric, Grace, Diane, and Dan a great round of applause for the great work that they have done. Thank our great chair, Commissioner Tim Shriver. And most important, let's give a great round of applause, Jackie, and the Aspen Institute for actually putting this together. Thank you, everybody. Great to be with you. Thanks, Diana. How many hogs you have?
Right now, we have 12 cows.
Wow, good for you.
All right.
That's nothing.
Yeah.
Let's hear it for our moderator, Governor Terry McAuliffe of the great. Thanks for coming. Now, Governor, one of the skills that's taught in these programs are listening skills. And I think we should compliment, wait a second, slow down, Diana, wait. I think the best listener in this room is Enzo. Is it Enzo? Is that your first name? No digital device. Can you stand in the middle here? Because that's a young man who's ready to teach, not just to listen. But you listen. I watched you. No cell phone. How many people didn't look at their cell phone? Honestly. And nobody. You're the only person in this room who listened to your mom the whole time. So I want to thank you and congratulate you. Well done. Did your mom do well? Yeah. Mom did well. Thanks to the panel. I have so many questions and so many comments. I have like lists of notes. I have a whole speech I want to give after that extraordinary panel, but instead of that, you get to watch a short video.
I'm a part of a group of students that has been exploring a new vision for schools and learning. We need to be seen and valued as whole learners. Schools can do this by just helping us build skills like teamwork, leadership, and stress management, as well as our academic knowledge. These are just a few of our stories that have led us to see how our learning can be different.
For school to support social, emotional, and academic growth, it's really critical that every student in that building, in that environment, has at least one solid relationship with an adult in that building. It doesn't have to be a teacher, it can be a building services worker, an administrator.
When I was in the 10th grade, that was actually when my mother passed. It was a very hard time. I was only 15. I had this responsibility that a 15-year-old shouldn't have, making sure we had food in the house and making sure the bills were paid with the money that she left behind. My teacher She sensed that something was wrong, and I just felt that she was annoying at first. She would always ask me questions, oh, how's everything at home, or do you need extra help? And like over time, I began to open up to her and basically tell her everything that was going on. And she started actually tutoring me. She wasn't getting paid extra to do it. And not only tutor me, but she was being a mentor to me.
Dr. Jackson was someone who is and was, when she was my principal, very much so committed to this idea that one's circumstances don't have to define their outcomes. That attitude permeated throughout the entire school because she had just as much high expectations of her students as she did her staff. And if anything, we had, I would say, high caliber and high quality, instructors and educators because Dr. Jackson set the expectation and set the tone of what was to take place.
My teacher had written me this note that captured both things in the classroom, captured this election that I had won to be the treasurer of the school, also to recognize that I was going through something, and I think that really allowed me to refocus my efforts and refocus my energy. I think it really spoke to the fact and the idea that teachers know you as people who don't just come into the classroom with a mind that's perfectly focused in every way on what's in front of you, and that you have to face what's happening in the outside world in order to come into the classroom ready to learn.
I am a lifelong learner.
I'm a student who views the world with empathy.
I am a leader.
I am an educator.
I am an advocate for educational equity.
I am a mentor.
And I am a whole learner.
I am a whole learner.
I am a whole learner.
Please join us. Read and sign our youth calls to action. Tell us when you felt like a whole learner and bring this conversation to your own classrooms.
All right. Nicely done. Nicely done. Beautiful. So don't forget you've got your cards at your seats. If you haven't started taking notes or filling them out or thinking about your own contribution, please remember. And also, the governor did a nice job at the end of reminding us that you have these reports. We're not just here to have a discussion. We're here to amplify the voices and to listen to the voices that have come to us from parents and kids. So please take the time to review them. The whole idea of intentional attention to the social emotional learning of children, I think, comes through powerfully in the reports. So we're ready for our next panel. It will be led by the the movie star we just saw on the screen, who's also happens to, that was you, Chris. That's you. He's looking around like, is there somebody here? I hadn't seen. But I'm delighted to welcome the moderator of the next panel, Chris Harriet, a commissioner of the National Commission, a teacher in Baltimore City, a native of Baltimore City, a master's candidate at Johns Hopkins University, and a fellow traveler around the country. We've sat in a lot of school buses together and joined in trying to imagine a more hopeful future, and he is a powerful architect of those ideas. Chris Harriet, come on up.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. Good morning. All right, so I'm really honored to be joined today by 4 leaders who will share their perspectives on the implication of these calls to action for the Commission, as well as their own schools, organizations, and communities. We're going to start with Roberta Duvall, who's also a member of our Council of Distinguished Educators, who I learned today is in her 29th year as an educator. So basically, she's been teaching since she was 5.
Yes, that's right.
Having served as a teacher and administrator for Washoe County School District in Reno, Nevada. So we can give it up for Roberta.
Thank you.
Also joining the stage is Shane Evans, who's another member of our Council of Distinguished Educators. He's the founding and managing partner at the Academy Group and former chief executive officer and director of the University of Chicago Charter School, as well as a managing director of the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute. Shane Evans. Also, we have joining us Elizabeth Folks, representing the Boys and Girls Club of America, and is a member of our Partners Collaborative. She serves as a senior vice president of program training and youth development at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Elizabeth Folks. And last but certainly not least, a member of our National Commission, Karen Pittman, who is President and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment. Karen Pittman. All right, so our first set of questions pertain to the core elements of our calls to action, right? So we have each of these different groups that we're getting together, the Youth Commission, we have our National Commission, our Council for Distinguished Educators and Parents, who are coming together to try to really discuss these questions as we are going through and trying to figure out what it means for students to be able to learn and contribute to their holistic development. I want to start with Roberta. So in the family call to action, the members state that they want communication efforts to be clear, concise, early, and often. So my question to you is, how is your school communicating with parents about your school's efforts to support students' social, emotional, and academic development?
I think that's something that we've been continuing to work towards and to build our efforts. We're certainly not where we want to be at this point in time, but I think it's just that frequent communication, and in our school it's a requirement that every team has a weekly communication with their families. And we highlight what it is that the students are doing in the classrooms. We highlight social, emotional, academic lessons that were being taught in those classrooms so that parents can have that conversation at home. So it's that frequent weekly communication, but we also, as a school whole, we have a every Sunday night kind of little tidbit that we get out there. Websites, whatever form of communication our families are comfortable with, we try to share. We don't want to overdo it, of course, but and we've done that too. But then it's just a matter of genuinely an open door policy. When families walk into our building, we know that many of them are uncomfortable already coming into our building. So by golly, we open the doors, we say, please come in, how can we help you? And I think that it's a variety of things that we try to do for the individuals who are coming in.
What type of feedback have you gotten from parents in response to your approach?
They love it, especially our weekly communication as it pertains to what they're doing in the classrooms, because we know middle-level adolescents aren't always really good about sharing what they do at school. The typical, what did you do today? Nothing much. So our parents actually get to learn more about what is actually happening, and then when they ask students questions at home, the students are kind of looking at them like, how do they know this? So it's been very well received.
Wonderful. So in our youth call to action, and any of you can feel free to respond to this, we highlighted the importance of the role of our relationships with our teachers, right? As a school leader, how do you help teachers develop relationships and learning experiences that support students' social, emotional, and academic growth?
For our staff, we're no different than our students. We all come to the table with a different set of skills, and some of us have stronger interpersonal relationship skills than others. And so it's a matter of building that human capacity through a variety of training, development opportunities, and practicing. We establish practices of policies and procedures and just things that we're trying to build in as a foundation for our core. And that way we have the opportunity to practice those skills each and every day, just like we would expect our students to.
Wonderful, thank you. So Shane, with your role at the Academy Group, you're focused on cultivating the individual backgrounds and interests of your students. So both of our documents call for this, but this can be a real challenge. Can you share some of the strategies you are pursuing that foster students' individual social, emotional, and academic growth?
Absolutely, Chris, thanks for that question. I think first at the Academy Group, and before I started that organization a year and a half ago, I ran a set of charter schools on Chicago's South Side, serving kids from pre-K to 12th grade. And what we start with at the Academy Group and what we wanted to start with at University of Chicago Charter School was belief in young people. And so Tim talked about earlier about young people today being patriots. So when I was in the back on my phone, unfortunately, I started, I went to Wikipedia on patriots, right, on the American patriots. And of course I find like John Adams, right, and Thomas Jefferson. But of course I also find, Crispus Attucks, right, one of the first African Americans to fire a shot on American shores for revolution. And so what that means to me, of course, is that we believe that any and all of our young people have ambitious goals, unbelievable talent, and unique perspectives and intelligence. Well, if we start with that kind of belief, right, and our adults believe that about the young people they serve, then they're going to build relationships that, A, are extremely supportive of where young people are and meeting them with the problems or challenges that they face. And it also means, from an ambition standpoint, that your ideas matter, that you absolutely can start the next app, the next movement, the next march, because you're uniquely qualified to bring that belief and agency to bear because of who you are.
Wonderful. I'm curious, I remember beforehand we got a chance to talk a little bit more about the model that you use at the Academy Group. I'm wondering if you could speak to any of the social and emotional skills that you've seen or you believe help prepare young people for the workforce.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So the program that we work with now, we serve young people from 3rd to 12th grade, and we had high school juniors this past summer. And we had something called Lunch with a Leader. 90% of the students that we serve are Black and brown students from Chicago's South and West Sides. And during a 2-week seminar, what we basically did was bring every day a high-powered CEO, executive principal. We had the leader of Chicago Public Schools, Janice Jackson, but we had Don Thompson, former CEO of McDonald's and one of 3 African-American male CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. They came and spoke to our young people every day about who they were, what they did, and what they had to face. On a scale of 1 to 5, we believe in data at the Academy Group. And so what our students told us every single day was the best thing that we did with a 4.9 out of 5 was create belief. And how we created belief in them was by exposing them to great and powerful leaders who either looked like them, sounded like them, or at least spoke to their talents.
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Elizabeth, both the documents call for strong partnerships between schools and communities. How does the Boys and Girls Club engage with schools and communities to support students' social, emotional, and academic development? And what does this look like across the country?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, when I think back to where we started this morning and the sort of worlds we can imagine, I can imagine a world where we're having this conversation and we're not talking about schools and out of school time and schools and community-based organizations, but we are talking about kids and what they need in order to be the future leaders in this country and the universe of people who care about getting them there, right? And so I can imagine that world, and yet I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are today so that we can kind of see the distance that we have to travel to get there. Just for a little bit of context, Boys and Girls Clubs are across the country where youth development organizations largely functioning in that out of school time and summer space. And there's about 4,400 clubs across the country in communities, in public housing, located in schools, on military installations, in native lands. So there's a ton of diversity. As much diversity as there is within those different clubs, there is diversity in relationship between those local clubs and their school-based partners. It's a hugely important part of the way that we serve young people because we do want to see them as whole people and think about them holistically in their experience across the day. So when I think about where we are today in terms of the relationship between community-based organizations like clubs and schools, there's a huge spectrum. There are cases where it is tightly coupled and cases where it is decoupled. And so sort of starting at one end of the spectrum, when there is the least amount of specific connection between these two groups, I do think simply moving forward in this path on some of these calls to action, that when we are successful at thinking about young people and their whole scope of development, minimally we'll start to see that young people will start to experience a similar set of expectations whether they're talking about at 9 o'clock in the morning or we're talking about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a similar set of expectations that we are thinking about all the sides of their development. So I think that's already happening in some cases. In other cases, that the tie between the school time and the community-based organization is more about, we know that reflection is an important part of the learning process. If we don't take the time to stop, to reflect on what's happened, and then think about how we're going to apply that learning next time, the learning doesn't root. So the community-based organization provides a space for young people to reflect on what's happening to them during the school day, to reflect on what they're learning, to reflect on what's happening to them at home, and start to provide opportunities to not just reflect on that, but to practice the skills they're learning in school in the out-of-school time context, where they can translate that into other domains. The third sort of thing along the spectrum, I would say, is where we actually start to get more connection between in-school and out-of-school time, where we're actually sharing information about what's happening with young people. When someone had a challenge during the school day, is having a challenge with an academic subject, is having a challenge with other students, that information is being shared so that there's another caring adult in a different kind of space where a young person may be able to act and interact a little bit differently, and that can actually be addressed. So there's information sharing. And then at the other end is where there's really tight coupling, where you actually have staff dropping in, whether that's school staff coming into the out-of-school time space, out-of-school time staff dropping in during the school day to do mentoring and tutoring. And right now, I'd say there exists really that full spectrum. And that co-locating of community-based organizations within the school can be very helpful, but is absolutely, it is not true that simply co-locating gets us to the close end of the spectrum with the tight connections.
Definitely, I definitely can attest to that. In just my own development, coming through after-school programs were a big deal in Baltimore, and they still are. I would remember I'd have homework that I didn't understand, and because of that co-location, some of my teachers also were in an after-school program. They were also facilitators. I could simply go to them, after school ended, and we could get into my homework. We could also talk about, what's going on at home, what's going on with my family. So it's actually pretty common for me to see former teachers and them to give me the whole rundown. How's your family doing? How's this? Because we had the opportunity to build those authentic relationships. Karen, some of the asks in these calls to action are strategies that the youth development sector has been emphasizing for years, right? So how can schools learn from some of the best practices from youth development organizations?
Again, a great question, and I think Elizabeth just shared a lot of the reasons why we should be learning, the things that are happening. Let me back up a little bit and explain, I think, how we can do that in a more intentional way. Just to her first point, the first thing is that, if we want to imagine that we are talking about this nested set of learning environments that young people go throughout the day and throughout the year, whatever they're called. We want continuity in them. So in that space, what youth organizations have had the luxury of learning is what it looks like when young people get to vote with their feet. So I'm going to give you a reason why the learning that we've had, the luxury of being voluntary organizations has been so important for learning. Tim started out by basically saying learning is social and emotional. If you don't feel socially accepted and emotionally safe, you've got three choices in that sort of fight or flight mode. You're either going to act out, you're going to tune out, or you're going to get out. In youth organizations, you just leave. In schools, you don't have the choice of getting out. So you're going to pick one of those other two, and either you're not going to learn or you're going to get in trouble and get suspended. So you've got a difference right there. For youth organizations, in order to actually do the intentional work that they want to do, they have to start very specifically making sure their adults are trained to make sure young people feel welcome and supported. So they do lead with relationships and with that idea of both physical safety but emotional safety. The second thing is what we know about learning is learning requires engagement, right? Engagement means I think what I'm learning is relevant. I think what I'm learning is rigorous. It's really a false statement that young people don't want to be challenged.
That's correct.
Definitely.
And I think that what I'm learning, I'm going to have a chance to actually apply someplace. I'm going to get to use it. It's going to be real. I get to really use it. Again, as a voluntary organization, we have more choice in what young people are learning. We can help them learn things that they're interested in, but we still have to meet those goals. A lot of youth organizations, Truth in Advertising, lose young people by the time they get to the high school years because we haven't figured out how to add that rigor and relevance and relationship in there. So they come for the relationships, they get into it for the learning, but if we don't have that learning grow with them, they leave. So I'm not saying youth organizations are perfect, but it's a space in which we've had more opportunity to intentionally experiment in that. And the third is learning eventually should lead to leadership, to your ability to solve problems, as the governor mentioned, to your ability to take initiative, both in your own life and in your community. And youth organizations have more opportunity to practice that. So whether we're talking about service learning or just young people really being able to take charge in planning projects and moving things forward, those are the kinds of things that we can learn. How to do it? My quick answer is most of the young people in schools are connected to some kind of youth or community organization. Sit them down and ask them in a very structured way what they get in those organizations that they don't get in schools, and then ask them why. Because we're not just talking about in school and out, we're talking about a nested set of environments in which it's possible to have the space to make this stuff happen. So in your core subjects, where it's heavily content focused and the teacher and the student are pushed towards getting something done, there's not a lot of space for this learning. Come out to your elective courses, you may have a little bit more space. Come out to your extracurricular activities, even if they're run by school, you've got more space. Now add into that those activities that are out in the community or being offered by community organizations, you've got even more space. So this idea that it's school and out of school is really a poor proxy for the fact that if we want to really integrate social, emotional, and academic development, we need space, we need flexibility, we need support, we need everybody to get training, and it's more likely that that can happen when we don't have the over-constrictions on top of it of saying you have to get this much learned in this 45-minute segment. So we've just had more flexibility. We've had a whole lot less money, let me just be clear, but we've had a whole lot more flexibility to really figure out what intentional learning looks like when you lead with learning needs to be about action and reflection.
Definitely. Shane, you spoke to your program serving students in grades 3 through 12. So I'm curious, and almost as a response to Karen's point, how do you engage those students who are secondary learners who are a little bit older? What's the dynamic of the relationship, rigor, and relevance?
I really enjoyed what Karen had to say about engagement. At Wakanda University, Shuri learned, right? In Wakanda U, Shuri learned physics, metallurgy, chemistry, math, and applied geometry through her time making weapons out of vibranium. And she wasn't also solving fake problems in school. She actually had to learn to master the content there, because as chief security officer, chief technology officer, it was her responsibility to keep Wakanda safe. And so if we could take what we learned from the unbelievable movie Black Panther and apply that to what Karen said and what we're hoping to do in schools, is that young people are actually brilliant. They love learning. Schools do an amazing job of extinguishing that learning. Speaking to when we get the call about snow day, we're like, yes. Whereas if you were extremely excited to go to your snowboarding lesson and it got canceled, you'd be disappointed. And so what we have to be able to do is support teachers, principals, administrators, which is a challenging job as someone who was in that field for a long time. But we've got to do what Karen said. At the elementary level, if we want to teach accounting, instead of going to the textbook, we can give young people checkbooks. And then open up the sales paper and say, okay, you've got $500, you get to spend $250, go. Next thing you know, 8-year-olds know profit and losses. This summer, right, our program, we're gonna work with 5th graders, we're gonna have them do a food truck. And so again, that's about entrepreneurialism, but it's also about fractions. And it's also about decimals and math. For our 11th and 12th graders, we're gonna have them start their own programs, either around calls to action or community engagement, but that takes what? Political science, history, writing, effective communication. We could just give them an essay to write, or we could have them solve a problem on the South Side. And we know that when we give young people access, power, and intentionality, they usually exceed the expectation.
Definitely. Roberta, I'm curious as to, in your role as a school leader, what's the dynamic that you've experienced working with community-based organizations or after-school programs as it relates to the social, emotional, and academic development of students?
We've had struggles in our community because of our location. We're right on the California-Nevada border, and so the term city fare is a public transportation system. Well, in our area, city fare doesn't get you there. And so we have to be creative and we have to come up with other means. We do have a community resource center that is really more of a homeowners association, and they charge people to come and use the facility and things like that. But we've kind of adopted them a little bit, and so we've played this, we'll share our space if you. And so we are able to get some after-school care taken care of with some of our students, and we share our space. And so then we're able to have very delicate conversations when we know we have a child that has some difficulties. Maybe they're not having the opportunity to have dinner. We talk to the Community Resource Center and say, okay, how can we partner up? But we're having to do this on our own. And so those resources aren't heavily available. The food trucks weren't even coming out into our area, and we finally have them coming out as well. And so it's really been spurred on by my social workers. We have a grant for our school in our zone for social workers to actually come in and serve students and their families during the school day. And of course, they do a lot of work after school as well. But that's those ties that we're trying to build into our community because they've been lacking for all those years. So that's a start.
Definitely. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to talking about how can we strengthen the great work that you're already doing. Karen, how will the forum continue to support bringing youth and family voices into critical community level conversations to support students' growth and development?
Well, we will keep doing what we're doing, which is to do exactly that. We're a national organization, but we spend a lot of time on the ground. And one of the things that we do, I'll give a very concrete example. We just, Rita Irby, the co-founder of the forum, just spent several days in Richmond, both training the Boys and Girls Club staff and to facilitate what will be an ongoing set of conversations with young people and parents and families in the neighborhoods in which the clubs are working. This is towards a commitment of basically saying, it's great for a youth, any organization, in this case the Boys and Girls Clubs, it's great for us to basically make sure young people are having great experiences when they come in the building, but we want them to have great experiences when they leave the building. And so can we really start conversations with young people and their families about what it is that they imagine for their young people. What do you want to have? I mean, what do great environments look like? What do the people who support your young people look like, whether you want to call them mentors or staff or neighbors? What do they look like, and do you have enough of them? What are the experiences that young people really need to have if they're going to build these skills and grow to be successful in this broader definition of success? And then how do we want young people to get to those experiences? In space and time, what is it? Is it sitting in classrooms? Is it being out doing community service? What does that look like? So it's great to have conversations like these, but one of the things that the forum does is basically bring sort of structure and intentionality to those conversations, so you're actually capturing data. So you mentioned data. So you can have community conversations and in a very organic way get people with Post-its and sticky walls and things to use their own language to put up their vision. You just give them a little bit of structure and they will tell you, this is what we want the environments to look like. This is what we want the adults to look like. This is what we want the experiences to look like. This is how we want our young people to be able to move in and out of those in their own language. A lot of consistency in that language, and then we basically put those together over a course of a series of conversations. They had one in each of the neighborhoods where they have clubs, and we're about to bring that back. That's the kind of thing that we're committed to do with the forum. And it's the same thing works when you're sitting with a group of policymakers or you're sitting with a group of young people. You give them a broad frame, you give them a way to put their own language into that frame, and then what you show them, which is quite empowering, is you basically have, in your own way, sort of described what the research people tell us is good practice. And they go, well, good, then why aren't we doing it? Then the conversation flips to, so what do we need to do? If this is not only common sense, but research-based work, why can't we do it better? And now you've got people organized and ready to decide what to do. And the Boys and Girls Club of Richmond was bold enough to say, tell us what you want us to do to be a better organization to serve these neighborhoods more broadly. So those are the kind of things that we do, and those are the kind of things we will continue to do, and happy to do it with any of you.
Chris, if I could, I really liked what Karen had to say about empowering people in that sense. Like, we had two strong, fabulous, fierce parents on the panel just now, and there's this assumption sometimes in schools or in communities that parents aren't necessarily empowered and ready to be, part of this work. So sharing the data with communities, oh, well, normally the data is for the practitioners or for the policymakers. Well, in Chicago, 12 years ago, there was a new finding that basically 9th grade mattered for high school graduation. And so what they started in Chicago Public Schools was something called Freshmen on Track. And at the time in 2006, 57% of students in Chicago were on track to graduate, meaning you would pass all of your 4 core classes as a freshman. They shared that information with school leaders and teachers, but they also shared that information with parents and students. And not because the students were any more brilliant now than they were then, because the students were already brilliant. It was more so that parents called to action and required their schools to be effective schools. Practitioners then had to respond to the demand of the market from the parents based on the data. Now that number's 84% in Chicago for 9th grade students on track to graduate. There's very little lag between the 9th grade indicator and high school graduation. So Chicago now, with Black and brown students being the majority of the students, is trending towards an 80% high school graduation rate. We have miles to go in Chicago as far as converting that into college graduation, but it's a great example of what Karen says of when we empower young people and parents with data, typically what we just think has to do with people from the higher ups, we can really kind of, constitute change.
Wow, definitely. Pushing to Elizabeth. So in both documents, the students and families talk about the fact that in order to support students as whole learners, you need to look at their whole day. How can community-based organizations and schools more closely align?
So I loved this in one of the calls to action where the students talked about they talked about in the cafeteria, in the hallways, and, and in the classrooms. This idea that and when I take that into community-based organizations, yes, there are times young people may be in a community-based program for anywhere from 2 to 10 hours a day. Right, depending on if we're talking about summer, we're talking about after school, anywhere from 2 to 10 hours a day. There are going to be moments within that time where young people are in a program that is intentional and explicit about developing certain skills, right? And many of those being explicit in the social and emotional sort of domain. And yet, whether we're talking about in school or we're talking about in a community-based program, that is going to be a fraction of the amount of the total time that a young person is in that environment. So the moment from when the young person enters the door all the way through, we've thought a lot about social and emotional development, in our case, throughout the club day. So what are the specific practices we can train staff on that are things that we can do upon arrival and check-in? What are the things that you can do as young people are transitioning from one activity to another that could otherwise be a wasted sort of moment, right? As a parent, my 6-year-old, one of his favorite things to say to me is, like, you're wasting my time, right? At 6, he understands how valuable his time is, right? And he's not wrong. He might have heard that from me. It's possible. It's possible that's where he got it, right? But he sort of gets the idea that time is precious, right? But, childhood and adolescence is a finite period of time, and we need to leverage every opportunity to have teachable moments and to have learning. And if you've got 30 kids standing in a line waiting to go from one place to another, not only is it a wasted opportunity, but you are likely to see conflict starting to happen, right? So how do we build the skills in the staff that are working with the young people so that those moments, whether we're talking about snack time or transition time or assembly time or arrival or dismissal, which is a great time to intentionally interact with parents and bring them in, right? That there's intentionality to that. But that does not just happen by accident. It doesn't happen because we sat around once and said, hey, we should do more of this, right? It's going to happen because it gets really integrated into the staff practice. It's going to happen because there are a set of standards that say this is what good looks like. There's a set of assessments so we can measure if we're doing enough of it, and there's aligned professional development so that staff are continually having those opportunities. And I don't mean training, right? I also mean training. Training is necessary but not sufficient, in the same way that teaching young people in a drug awareness program is necessary but not sufficient. You've got to have more reinforcement, whether we're talking about educating adults or we're talking about educating young people, that is opportunities for continual practice and reinforcement of that. So when we're talking about staff, we're talking about what are the conversations you're having in staff meetings and how often are you having them, and are they the right conversations? We're talking about observation and coaching, right? We're talking about having professional development plans. That's the level of intentionality we've got to get to have true integration across a spectrum for all staff. And then I want to take that to the level of, and if that go with sort of the practice of what you preach model. If that's what we want for young people, if that's what we want for staff, then when we start to talk about policy and the way that leaders of schools and the leaders of community-based organizations work together, that won't happen by chance either, right? So many of those interactions that I talked about earlier along the spectrum, those really tightly coupled ones where there's a really strong relationship, is a result of two people who have a great relationship. And that is fantastic, and it works really well until one of those people moves on. Because if it is not institutionalized, right, we need the relationship between the organizations. It's incredibly important, and yet we have to move from a reliance on relationship to bringing it into policy, frankly, to getting it to the point where it's a core value, that we work with every asset we have in the community in order to support what we're trying to accomplish.
Favor like an institutionalized intentionality. Yeah, I like that. Roberta, the youth highlight, so in the youth call to action, we highlight the importance of linking academics with social and emotional skills. This can often be the most challenging part of the work. So how are you working on this in your school?
Well, I think it really comes back to what Elizabeth referred to as the core values. And it starts from your master schedule. You have to be very purposeful and very intentional in terms of what does your master schedule offer students. Students have to be first priority. Do we have to have specialized classes? Do we have to do some things? And we do the responsible scheduling. But more importantly for our school is the inclusion of teaming and advisory programs. You have to have this to be able to build that core set of values. We are a team school. What does that mean? So we learn to coexist in a team. We want every child to be able to walk into those doors saying, okay, I know I have one adult that I can count on. I know that I have a team of students who I can go share lunch with. And those are just the beginning stages. But then it just extends from there, where we have requirements when it comes to academics. It needs to be relevant and meaningful. We need to be able to build interdisciplinary units so that we're not just walking into English class and having some research paper there. And then we go to social studies and it's a separate research paper. Why can't it work together? And why can't we be working towards problem solving and higher level thinking and enhancing student voice? And so when you start with your master schedule, you start with purposeful training and development, and it's training and development that's ongoing for staff, but it's also ongoing for our students. And it's providing opportunities. We do this one check and balance every quarter, and that is we have a list of every child from every team on these big posters. And the teachers go through, and we start with, do you know this student by name and face? Do you know this child's, something unique about this child? They love the Giants or whatever it is. And then we went into their academic progress. What do you know about them? Are they progressing? Are they regressing? What's happening? And then we added, what's their personal story? Okay, you know they love the Giants, but where are they coming from? What's their background? And so we continued to build on that all year long. And I'll tell you, the teachers get very fixed on that because they see some blanks. They'll see students that they haven't touched yet, and it really bothers them. So they go back and they really start to learn and focus more. Simple little things like that carry a lot of weight. But again, it's your master schedule. It's that foundation that you establish. Are they meeting and greeting them at the door when they first walk in every day? You know, little things like that carry a lot of weight. So it starts there.
I love that. I want to just mention, I love that sort of level of intentionality around the individual sort of young people. And it just made me think, you know, this conversation about you know, data and information, that there's sort of that practice at the staff level in terms of looking at individual young people, and then how do we also translate that into using the data to figure out where we drop in to support staff in the same way. So, you know, one club organization that we work with tracks behavior incident reports from a data perspective, so that when they see a spike in the number of incident reports, they actually drop additional staff in, not to intervene with the kids, but to support the staff and to say what's happening here. Because if we're seeing a spike in incidents, there's got to be something going on. It's not about blaming the kids. It's about saying, how do we help?
Definitely. Shane, in the youth document, the students talk a lot about culture and climate, feeling safe in their schools, right? So what can be done to help build a strong sense of community within a school?
I thought the panel this morning really did an excellent job of addressing the various types of safety, Chris. I think first and foremost, obviously, just from a physical safety standpoint, we have to work with young people and our community members to create a safe place. Right, I'm from 75th and Exchange on the south side of Chicago, man. A one bedroom, it was not a safe space. And I remember always being afraid of like what that meant. Right, I'm on the south side, I have a white mom, my dad's not around. That's not fresh for me. And I read comic books to create a sense of safety for myself so that I could get my own mind right to walk into a school and be prepared. So as a school leader, we had the option of getting metal detectors, or we had an option of talking to our young people. And so what we were very intentional about was just building relationships with our young people. And so one of our young people would tell us when someone had something in their locker. And we were able to build those relationships. It was not perfect. We've all been in schools, led schools, taught at schools. There's no way that you can keep track of 600 students, much less 6,000. But I think one is really working with your young people to have a relationship of what's happening, who shared what on social media, who's about to fight and why, you know, so we can get into a room. I think that's first and foremost. But then the flip side of that, because that's again the downside of what's happening out here, is this safety. We talked about emotional safety, but I also just want to talk about like intellectual and ambition safety. Because when do young people of color get the safety to dream? You know, Elon Musk has crashed thousands of rockets and Tesla still does not make money. But it's like everyone believes in him and he still believes in himself. Right. But black folks on the south side of Chicago created Uber 50 years ago when cabs wouldn't go there. It was called Jitney. And so it was ride sharing before ride sharing. but those folks didn't have the vulnerability and the intellectual safety to launch a business. And even now, it's like we necessarily can't take a gap year. And so I think we have to provide real safety, no doubt. And there's the sense of this is a dream technology and dream like environment right now. And so the opportunity to create for young people, for any background, to have the ability to dream is important.
Definitely. As we come to a close here, I'm curious as to one tidbit from each of your different experiences that you would like to share as it relates to our students and being able to bring families in and support social and emotional and academic development of students. So if we could actually start with Elizabeth, that'd be great.
Oh, sure. Gosh, I think I'm just so glad that this conversation is happening. I think it's so incredibly important, and pleased that we're having it holistically, and so glad that you all started it today. Hearing, some of the really big issues that the governor brought up earlier about sort of the future, and I really appreciated, Eric, your comments about that the future is here, right? It is right now, and yet. I don't know exactly what the world's going to look like when you are my age. I don't actually know how our job market is going to evolve by the time you get to be my age. And so what I do know is that, having seen the young people who were up here earlier, having read the call to action, having read what you all wrote, that those other, those core skills that are absolutely transferable, not just across business industries, but across time, are going to serve us all really well. And so I'm grateful.
I think coming from the heart of a mom first, I remember my oldest going into kindergarten, and the teacher gave us our very first homework assignments as parents. And she said, what is it? What are your goals for your child? And my husband and I deliberated over that, oh gosh, for quite some time. And we finally came up with, we want our daughter to like going to school. We want our daughter to feel successful and to feel happy about being at school. And that was really, as an educator, but that's what I want the most. So if that's what I want for my child, that's what should be for every child walking through my doors. And so I think that's why it's really important to be able to enhance building relationships. We've got to get to know each other. As teachers, oftentimes our students think that we come out of the lockers in the mornings and then we go back in at night. And that's not the case. We actually are people too, and we have lives. But it's okay for us as educators to build a climate in our buildings that says, hey, I'm an adult and guess what, I was wrong. Or I'm sorry. Or I need your help as a student. And I think that's the kind of relationship we have to build with our students so they too can say, hey, this problem's rather complicated. I don't understand it. Okay, let's work it out together. That's the environment that we want our children to be able to coexist in and to be able to say, hey, I am so unique and I am so different and I am accepted here. And that's what we value for every child walking into our buildings. And so building relationships and building in restorative circles and enhancing student voice is what's going to get us there. And I'm very excited and very passionate about that. I know that in our core values in our building, I could walk away tomorrow and my teachers still feel very passionate about social emotional academic development because they know that in order for our students to really be able to achieve on those assessment scores, they've got to have this first in order to do that, to take on the rigor and challenges. And so it's very exciting, and I want this for every child in every school.
Karen?
Well, this has been a great panel. I would say for us, we want to work hard to make sure language doesn't get in the way. We've heard a lot of different terms today, et cetera. This is really about supporting young people's growth and development, right? And if development is a good enough word when we're in early childhood, it should be a good enough word to take us all the way through. How do we support young people's growth and development so that they can be successful in the broadest sense of the word success, college, work, and life? In order to do that, what we really need to give all of us, schools clearly, that's the conversation today, but every place where young people spend time and adults are intentionally trying to support their development, we basically need to ask this question. What is your official practice? And does it support development? because we know what it takes to support development. We've got plenty of research that says this is what developmentally supportive environments look like. This is what the adults look like and how they act if they're supporting development. This is how you create experiences, whether they're academic, they're employment focused, they're faith-based. This is how you create experiences that young people actually want to spend time in. We know those things, right? We've known it for years. So can we just stop and ask the question, just as you did? I have a choice to set my official practice. Is it going to be metal detectors and out-of-school suspensions, or is it going to be youth-led discussions and building trust? You just made your official practice support developmental practice. Our families can do that. Our schools can do that. Our community organizations can do that. Our faith-based organizations already do that. We want to be intentional about it. And whatever the languages that we use, we want to share that language together, but it really should be generated through community conversation.
Definitely. Shane?
No, I want to double down with what Karen said. When I first started teaching,
We're now best friends, by the way.
That's what we do here.
This sounds good to me. But I have to be transparent. When I first started teaching, right, I was just the mean demander. Like I was just on kids' heads, like, oh, you're going to do my work, and if you don't do it, there'll be double work. But so one of the power things about what's happening with the call for action, I think, is we're really training our educators to evolve and get better with their practice. I think the second thing we can do is hire more young people like this young man. I mean, if we had this young man in all of our schools would be amazing. And then I think third, what I heard from Grace, really one of the things I think I heard from her comment was, we have to love all young people. And we have to love Me Too, just like we love Parkland, just like we love Black Lives Matter. Like if we not just tolerate difference, but actually love and celebrate difference, then we're really messaging to our young people, we love you. No matter what shape, size you come in, no matter where you come from, we just love you and we're here to support you.
Thank you. Shane, Karen, Roberta, Elizabeth, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we were going to have both panels for questions, but the first panel jumped the gun and got some questions in. So we still want to include the panelists from the first panel in the remaining 10 or 12 minutes we've got. But I'll just ask Chris to moderate then, just a discussion with this extraordinary group of leaders and with our previous ones as well. So the floor is open for questions.
Sure. Can we start right here? Because you're closest to the mic.
Lucky me.
Right.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm a writer with EdSurge, and I've been reviewing some research about social emotional learning practices and school discipline. You guys kind of brought that up a little bit earlier in the first panel a bit more. And one of the things that I found that was interesting that researchers said was that social emotional learning practices had kind of a limited promise of changing school discipline because it doesn't consider things like structural biases and also what is considered healthy social behaviors for certain cultures. And so I'm just curious what you all's response to that kind of possible limitations in social emotional learning and constructive constructions are like in classrooms and schools.
I'll jump in. So I think one of the dangers that we have, and you just raised it, is going too quick to assume that we can take a specific practice like restorative justice, et cetera, and move it in to replace a deeply ensconced official practice like school suspensions. It's a process. You may get there at the end, and the superintendent in Austin, for example, sort of tells a story of how they moved toward this. The first thing they had to do was just ask the basic question, is this policy helping our kids? And is it disproportionately hurting some kids? And they had to get the answer to that question. And the answer was, it's not helping any kids, and it is disproportionately helping kids. Then we should stop it. Then he started a set of conversations about, why did it happen? Why is this thing going on? They had to generate their own answers to why it's happening. Then, what could we do about it? Once you've answered those questions, you may then get to, so the solution is we want to adopt restorative justice. But if you just push these two things together, it's going to feel like a very weak solution to a very ensconced problem.
And if I could also, similarly to the point that you just made about restorative justice, that 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 every solution, every skill that we want to develop, every program or service that we have an idea for implementing doesn't mean that every student has to take advantage of them, but just making sure that they're there. And I know that there is like a fear or an argument that some people present about having like high volumes of support staff in schools. It's like, well, students should not be going to school to be diagnosed and da 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 da. Well, that's not the purpose of these, but like, we want these support staffs in schools so that students who need these supports, like for me, I didn't get my 504 until the end of my junior year. So I wasn't able to take advantage of those supports before in middle school, but I also wasn't able to take advantage to those for 3 years of high school. So making sure that all of these supports are available to students, but not that everybody has to take advantage of them, and of course being recognizing home structures and still recognizing the decisions that parents do get to make for their children, and respecting and celebrating that at the same time.
So I think there are two things. Number one, I think it's really important for school administrators and teachers to know their school community, to know their parents, to know the cultural backgrounds, the socioeconomic issues that may be part of their school community. And I also think it's important to have conversations with parents about what social emotional learning is. So I know for a lot of, for example, immigrant parents, they think, and my parents are immigrant parents, and they always said, you go to school to learn. These are the things you do. Like, they have very ingrained ideas of what a school should be, what teachers should do, what education should look like. So when a parent that may have those views goes to a school and the child says, oh, I meditated today or I did yoga, for some parents that might not be something that they're used to. So I think it's really important to educate parents and to invite them to kind of explore and say, this is what social emotional learning is. This is why it will benefit your child. Maybe the child learned to meditate and learned to breathe and now is acting out less at home. I'm just giving an example. But it really requires, I think, knowing the school community, knowing the parents, knowing the families, and also educating, a two-way street, right? Parents are educating school administrators and staff, and also the school is also kind of teaching and helping parents embrace what social emotional learning is in a way that is culturally relevant and also takes into account the linguistic barriers that might exist, because that's also something that a lot of diverse communities have to deal with.
Thank you. I saw some hands over here. We can go right here.
Hold on, I can just ask.
Mike's coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nina with Moms Rising Mamás con Poder. We talked a lot about safety in schools, and one of the things that's been weighing really heavily on me that we're just hearing a lot from, in particular, our Mamás con Poder community, is the trauma that immigrant communities are facing right now and the threat of family separation. And I think about it particularly as an adverse childhood experience, right? That threat of family separation, that threat on your body. And I'm curious to hear if any of you have dealt with families that are at risk of separation and how children are dealing with that. Because I can't even imagine what it must be like for a child to go to school and to be constantly worried that their parent may not be there when they get home. And so how is it that you're tackling that, or what are some of the ways that educators can tackle that, and how can we support families in those conversations? It's like 20 questions in one.
I will be happy to share our experience. For the very first time this year, I had a 5th grade child who had to say goodbye to her father in our front office. It was awful. It was just awful. I don't think there was a dry eye anywhere in our front office. And it was something that just was completely new to us. And so unfortunately, since then, we've had other situations that have arisen. And it's a matter of educating your staff. You really have to have that conversation with your staff. And I think, it's much like we want every child to be in class, and so you have to talk to them about how you approach and discipline, and we use restorative conversations. Well, it's very similar in terms of restorative conversations. Those are things we have no control over and in our school environment, but how do we provide supports? And that's when while pacing guides are so important, and by golly, I've got to have, you know, certain chapters of math done in 2 weeks and 3 weeks, it's okay. And you have to give your staff the flexibility to take a deep breath and say, this is going to come first, because if we don't address this, this isn't going to happen anyway. And I think that that's where, when we talk about building relationships and getting to know your students, they talk to the teachers and they talk to their team of teachers and their counselors. And we just have to stop and you see if there are any additional wraparound services that the families might need to help support them. But there is no one right answer currently. It's just approaching each child and what they need at that moment along with their families, because it's usually involving the other siblings too, some that are preschool, you know, so.
So I'll just add, you know, for a long time we had done some specific training and work in the bereavement space, and have really expanded that to think about grief is bigger than just bereavement, and how do you think about supporting a young person who might be grieving no matter what that is. And have then been able to also think about that in this broader social and emotional lens of building the resilience, so that when, you know, that we're helping to equip kids. But in that kind of situation, when we're really talking about sort of the grief of this kind of trauma for a young person, having the staff be prepared, having some specific, you know, practices, some specific activities, so that it is not something we don't talk about. There is a way in which we do. But you know, I think that's an uncomfortable moment. It's hard, right, for an individual staff person. And so for them to have a way to do that, and some specific sort of guided activities and experiences that they can use to address it helps.
If I may too, from a parent perspective at home, I think this is really important as well. I don't come from an immigrant community, so to speak. But in our rural communities, we have a lot of immigrants who are working on farms. And so we do have children of immigrants and first-generation Americans who are dealing with this. And from the schools too, I think it might be helpful even to provide guidance to families who might not know how to approach it at home. I know one of my daughters, one of her best friends is the daughter of undocumented farm workers. And so we talk a lot about how her friend is feeling, if she's bringing anything up, and how my daughter can be supportive to her, because it's important that we have that compassion from their peers as well.
So important. Saw some other hands over here. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Ellen Fern, and I do government relations for groups like CASTLE, Committee for Children, and After School Alliance. And I have to go back for a moment to the language issue for a moment, because my target audience to educate and try and move in a positive direction are members of Congress and staff. And so social and emotional learning is a compound topic, but we've done a lot of education and feel like we've got a basic handle on that with many members. But now when we talk about the interplay, Karen, I'm looking at you, of positive youth development, could you help me be more articulate, and maybe others, about how is social emotional learning part of positive youth development, separate but together? Could you help me? Anyone help me with that? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I would basically say just don't struggle. I mean, youth development is, by definition, integrated, right? When we talk about social and emotional learning or the integration of social, emotional, and academic development, what we're doing basically is signaling that we need some balancing happening in how adults who are charged with officially supporting learning environments for young people, how they're prioritizing how they create these learning environments. So there's a professional message that's going out, but you know, when you're talking to policymakers in particular, a decade ago, we stopped talking about youth development because it took us 10 minutes to explain what it was, and that it wasn't just about youth programs, and we said, we want young people to be ready for college, work, and life. And here are the skills they need to be ready. You can call them life skills, you can call them 21st century skills, but you can bring in data from the business community that says we want young people to be able to communicate, work in teams, be flexible, solve problems, and take initiative. Okay, I understand all those words. There's 40 more words you could pick, but they all fall into the same groups. So when we're getting ready to think intentionally about how we create learning environments, we need to cluster. We need a language frame that helps us cluster these things together. But when you're talking to people that are really ready to act, just use words that they understand.
It comes up, it's interesting, so when it comes up when there are federal funds potentially available, grant opportunities, and then you get caught up in the purpose areas and eligibility. And so in that way, you want to be as
you want to be as inclusive as possible. I mean, and the bigger things behind this are you go back to the youth development language. It wasn't about a particular set of organizations or systems. It's about it's about an asset-based approach to supporting young people, starting with their strengths, building on the strengths of the adults who are working with them, making sure that they are connected and involved in their communities in developmentally appropriate ways. And there is an interagency working group on youth development that has a long paragraph that describes what youth development is that you can draw most of your policies from. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about it.
I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. One more time, a round of applause for our two panelists.
Before we close, I just want to remind everyone that we're trying to get 1,000 signatures on our respective calls to action before the National Commission releases its final document at the end of this year. So you can go to as.pn/call to action to sign on. We want youth and families from all 50 states to sign on, and we're so grateful that you're here today.
Are we putting Tim out of a job here? I like it. Okay.
Excellent.
So the parent panel also would like to invite parents, community leaders, school leaders, and other caring and concerned adults to go ahead and log on to as.pn/call to action. You can sign your name there. You can help us reach our signature goals as well. And then also be sure to share these calls to action documents with your local school districts and other community leaders. We put a lot of work into them, and so we'd love to get the ideas out there and just to help get the ball rolling in your local community. And now I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Back to you.
I was out of a job, and I'm happy to be. The greatest outcome of all this work would be that all of this work would be redundant. We wouldn't need to have this conversation, right? But as Karen said at the end, we're rebalancing the way in which we see children in schools, and I can't say, I don't think I've ever listened for an hour and a half and not disagreed with one single thing I heard. I don't know about the rest of you, but I can tend to be adversarial in the way I approach ideas, just trying to test them for resonance. And I just want to thank all of you on behalf of the Aspen Institute for extraordinary insight. I mean, I'm writing so much I can't keep up. I guess by way of just closing, Shane mentioned Crispus Attucks as a patriot, which is wonderful, but let's remember why we remember Crispus Attucks. He gave his life. He gave his life for the ideal of the country. He just didn't give hard work. He just didn't give financially. He just didn't give time. He gave his life. And other people have given their lives and are giving their lives to the idea that they'll stand up for kids. And so this call to action isn't just one of these digital things where let's all go on Facebook and make nice and pretty and count the hearts and get everybody to follow us on Instagram and all that. I mean, that's all fine. That's all fine and well. But this is a powerful call to action. We heard calls to rigor, calls to responsibility, calls to ambition, calls to having a license to dream. These are fundamental, foundational issues for the future of our country. And we've waited too long. We've waited too long to wake up to what development is. We've waited too long. It's outrageous. I mean, some of this knowledge we heard today has been known for 100 years in textbooks. We're not reinventing the newest science. We're just trying to marshal what we already know on behalf of people who desperately need it and who, if they don't get it, will suffer. So it's a pretty straightforward equation. This is a call to action that is a serious one. It's not a Republican one. It's not a Democratic one. It's not a red state. It's not a blue state. It's a call to action for the country. So today has been wonderful, inspiring, and really urgently important. We ask everyone watching and everyone here to take the work as seriously as our panelists have. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon. No.
Thank you, everyone. Absolutely. I want to point to the back of the.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been such a wonderful day. We just appreciate the panelists, and thank you so much, Tim, for being here with us and just leading the day. And we hope that everyone can walk by the beautiful artistic rendition of the last couple of hours. We're going to make sure that this is accessible in some form through all of our technology. But thank you again.
All right.
Next door. Yeah, I was so used to that. Okay, great. Why not? Yeah. I'm in Boston. I can't wait to go back to this week. Actually, staying her place.